So you want to learn more about how to be an ally, how to be an anti-racist, and you don't know where to start. Or maybe you want to learn more about how to be a better ally or anti-racist. I know that there are so many resources out there and I love them, but the educator in me wants to provide some sort of structure, especially for those of you who may be starting out in learning more about systemic racism and oppression and multicultural education. So, brief overview of my background. I have worked in education for over a decade in both K-12 and higher education, and my master's degree was really focused on social justice. Although I had a bit of that in my undergrad, my master's took it to a whole new level. And it's one of those things for me that once you kind of see something, you can't unsee it. And since then, almost going on a decade now, it's a big focus of not only my professional life, but who I am. I'm just a really big advocate for social justice. I'm a big activist, and I love sharing the information that I have learned along the way, because not everyone gets a chance to have a social justice focused master's degree, or even bachelor's degree for that matter. So I recommended 4 resources that I think are great places to start if you're wanting to learn more about the end goal of being a better ally or anti-racist. Before we can get there, we need background and we need context, which is very important given how much of the racism and oppression in our country is deeply rooted in our country's history and how it's been running for a couple hundred years. So the resources I have are not the only ones. They are not the best ones by any means. They're just 4 that I've chosen because of not only my familiarity with them, but because they are, what's the word I'm looking for? Approachable, I would say. There's a lot to learn. Not everyone has time to open up big history textbooks. No one wants to feel like they have homework, especially if they're not in school, right? So the ones I have are just different formats that may speak to different people. And what I want to focus on first is systemic racism. So the structures and the laws and the practices in our country that are inherently racist, and they manifest themselves through education, through housing, through healthcare, health disparities, and so on. You can't really fight and advocate to be a true anti-racist until you don't get all the other stuff, because racism isn't just internal, it's very much external. And it's not like a light switch, like I'm not gonna be racist. So to that note, if you don't believe in white privilege, it's not Santa Claus, it's a real thing, but if you choose to ignore that, or you don't think racism is deeply embedded in the United States history, this is not for you, and I don't have time to try to convince you of that. Just letting you know. For the rest of you who have already been convinced of that, you just wanna know where to go now, I'm gonna start with my first resource for you. So this is actually a podcast and a series of essays and articles. So the 1619 Project is through the New York Times Magazine. I listened to the podcast, which I believe just came out this year in 2020. 6 episodes. Each episode was between 30 to 60 minutes, not super long. Where it starts is in the whole, I guess you could say genesis of this project was 1619 is the year that the first Africans were brought here and enslaved. They were brought to present day Virginia. And so that was kind of a recognition of the 400-year history we have in this country of slavery. So the podcast starts off with the narrator, Nicole Hannah-Jones. She also wrote about this, but through her own family's history and legacy of experiencing systemic racism, Jim Crow, she kind of starts to tell the story of 1619 through now. And in the podcast, she brings in several experts, a lot of great audio clips. There was an interview with a former slave. Obviously, it's a very old audio clip, but the fact that we can even hear that is tremendous. Really important to learn about history, especially the history that we don't know a ton about, including some about Lincoln that shows he wasn't the anti-slavery warrior we like to think of him as. So the podcast touches really upon all avenues of systemic racism from 400 years ago till now. Once you read the podcast, I suggest going over to the New York Times Magazine website, and it's a really cool interactive multimedia, essentially essay collection of the same title, 1619 Project. Awesome snippets of articles and essays and photos as well. So great intro. Second resource I'm gonna share, it's actually a novel. So The Nickel Boys is a novel. It's 200 pages. It recently won the Pulitzer. You might recognize the author, Colson Whitehead. He wrote The Underground Railroad, also a Pulitzer winner from 2016, I believe. So why would I include a novel in the mix? It's accessible. You probably don't want to crack open a textbook. You're not me, right? So The Nickel Boys is based off of the real, it's called the Dozier School for Boys. It was a reform school in Florida that opened in the early 1900s. It actually ran until 2011. And that's where boys as young as 8 were sent for all sorts of infractions or rule breaking or nothing other than being Black or another color or just poor. So essentially that school severely abused physically and sexually and murdered several of the boys. And this was a school that was kids were sent to be bettered. Instead, they were often killed. And it ran like this for decades. A few years ago, the site of the school in Florida was actually excavated in the back, the back lawn. There's this area that is kind of well known where kids went to go be punished, were taken rather. And as of now, almost 100 bodies have been found in a mass unmarked grave because all these boys who had been killed. So how does this tie into the Nickel Boys? Colson Whitehead fictionalizes that school very much based on the real thing. He follows 2 boys who are sent to the school, similar experiences while there, very different paths getting there, very different paths after. And what it shows really well is through beautiful narration. He's a beautiful writer. The legacy of something as small as being sent to a specific reform school, things that were out of these kids' control completely, and how it manifested itself years down the road, how it leaves a legacy on these individuals and their families. And the systemic racism is very prevalent. Also, there's an amazing plot, I guess you could say twist, to keep you on your toes. Okay, third resource is a documentary, 13th. So this documentary has been out for a few years. It's on Netflix. It's by Ava DuVernay, and it is fabulous. I just heard that viewership of this documentary has gone up like 4,000% in the last couple of weeks. There's reason why. Even though I've seen it, I definitely need to rewatch it because there's so much information. So essentially 13th is after the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in 1865. It ended slavery, but enter documentary. So essentially it's talking about how, slavery just didn't disappear overnight. The systems that supported it didn't disappear. And the society in which it existed did not disappear. It just evolved. And so essentially following how that has morphed over time into now our mass incarceration problem, our school to prison pipeline. And it's fascinating. It's hard to watch. It is very well researched, and there's a lot of great footage brought in. There's a lot of great, I would say, scholars on this issue who are also brought in. 2 hours, you're gonna learn a ton. Last resource is actually an article, another essay from The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations. So I have the original copy because when I got this in the mail, I was already familiar with Ta-Nahisi Coates, and I thought, this is important, and I'm kind of like a hoarder for magazines anyway. So I decided to keep it. This essay was written in 2014. It has had a lot of traction since then. So Ta-Nahisi Coates wrote this. The title, I think, puts off some people. It's not like, hey, pay descendants of slaves reparations now. Not the case. It is an essay that follows a man named Clyde Ross. He was born in the South, Jim Crow era. And it kind of, again, it follows these people and how the systemic racism is so real because it's real people's lives. And Clyde Ross was part of the Great Migration up north and in Chicago. You can see through so many facets of his life how he has been impacted by education, health, lack thereof, and then finally housing. So Ta-Nahisi Coates decided to focus preliminary on the housing disparity between Black and white families in the US. And the best way, the fastest way, the most secure way to build net worth in this country is through owning a home. Well, when people have not been given the opportunity to do so, which is very well outlined here, there's a disparity in that wealth. So white families own, and I've seen anywhere between 14 to 20 times more than the average Black family. A lot of that comes from housing. So anyway, this is a beautiful essay. It follows Clyde Ross's life, and it focuses in on housing and the housing discrimination that is still pervasive today, especially redlining, which you may have heard about, which still kind of exists today too. And through that, you kind of see he just wants to lay the groundwork to establish the discussion of why reparations, in whatever form that may be, would be a necessity. Since then, reparations has become a lot more of a common conversation. If you remember way back when, a few months ago, there were several people running for president on the Democratic side. Reparations was actually brought up quite a bit. That wasn't the case even 5 years ago. So it's really cool for that to gain some traction. So those are my 4 resources. Again, they vary in modality. Hopefully that speaks to kind of where you are and what you prefer in terms of how to consume information. These are not the only resources. I just wanted to provide things that are accessible. If you have any recommendations, let me know, and I would love to talk about these with you. Visit me on Instagram, Ordinary Citizen, or my blog, which is a work in progress, ordinarycitizen.com, and ordinarycitizenblog.com. And happy learning.